France and India are having elections, which means Islamophobia is rampant. Each election, they take Islamophobia a notch up, and people think after elections it will come down. It never comes down. It only goes up one way. And one of the person who is challenging all of that is joining us right from Paris, France. He's a human rights activist. So let me welcome Yasser Louati. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you for having me. Walaikum salam. Thank you for having me.
So what is your elections? Are you afraid of elections in France, that anytime elections happen, Islamophobia goes up?
Well, as usual, the gamble is that the more we speak of Muslims, the less you will have to speak of the real ills of the country. I mean, like, we are still in the midst of a pandemic. Over 100,000 people have died, nearly 200,000. The country is in shambles economically speaking, and of course, we have a deep defiance from French people towards the institutions of the so-called republic. And the bet being made by Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, and his government is that by institutionalizing further anti-Muslim racism and by cracking down on civil society, he will be perceived as the savior of French culture, French identity, and or the French economy. Unfortunately, this does not work. It, on the one hand, further criminalizes and marginalizes a whole segment of the French population, 10% of 60 million people of the population, and at the same time, it puts the focus on the wrong problems, if we can call them so. We would wish our candidates could speak of rising inequalities, for example, but we know that will not happen. And again, there is responsibility to be shared not only by the government, but also how silent the rest of society is towards this rise of neo-fascism, I would call it.
The French government is funny. They continue to establish organizations to control Muslim community. I remember after 9/11 visiting France with a think tank. I was in the government meeting some deputy minister or someone there, and they mentioned they have pretty good organized, and there is a council of Imam and mosques and things like that. And they sent us to the central mosque there. And there was an Imam, beautiful mosque. And after talking to Imam, I say, can I see the bylaws of your organization? Yasser, the gentleman, the sheikh there told me, oh, the guy who sent you to my office has the bylaws. So first time it dawned upon me that the French government created the institution. And now we hear that they have shut down that organization and created something else. So why French government is so much concerned about organizing the Muslim community?
Mr. Imam, when the answer to the question, why are you doing it? And the answer is because I can. Fundamentally, the problem lies with you. And the blame has to be put on Muslim leaders and Muslim organizations for allowing this to happen. First, we are in a secular republic. And there's a strict separation between religion and politics. The government, the state, have no right whatsoever to intervene in clerical affairs. They don't meddle in the affairs of the Catholic Church, despite the scandals of tens of thousands of kids being raped for the past 50 years. They don't meddle in the Jewish affairs in synagogues, despite many of them being recruitment hotspots for the occupation army of Israel. Yet when it comes to Muslims who are constantly seeking equal rights, they don't demand domination, they don't demand privilege, they only want to be treated as equal citizens. But in their case, the French government steps in and creates ex nihilo one organization after another. And yes, you're right, sir. You mentioned the Council of the French Council of the Muslim Faith, set up in 2003 by former President or then Minister of Interior Nicolas Sarkozy. And now, 18 years later, that same organization set up by the French government is dissolved and a new one is emerging. And yet we still see Muslim leaders, unfortunately, who are coming from overseas and I have no understanding of how French politics work. how French culture works and what it means to be citizens of a secular country. So they have been raised in their countries with all due respect, and I'm not, judging or anything like that. But they don't come with the understanding that in a secular country, religion is not there to serve the government. But them coming from their countries where Islam is subservient to local dictatorships, they have the same relationship with the government. And that's why the French state is doing it. And unfortunately, we don't see a wake up or a wave of calls from local media to say enough is enough. These are our own affairs. We should decide who represents the French Muslim communities throughout the country and who will be our elected leaders to speak to the government. So what Emmanuel Macron is doing today is just to step in an empty hall and then putting his flag and saying, this is an empty place and I'm going to frame everything according to my own will. And it will continue as the same way for years, just as it has been happening or it happened in the 19th, 20th century colonies in the Muslim world, especially in the Algerian conflict. The French government, despite being secular again, nominated imams in order to make sure they promote a brand of Islam that would call for obedience towards the colonial power and not allow Muslims to be free individuals who can organize against tyranny of the occupying power.
So Yasser, you were saying that essentially it's the Imam and the Muslim leaders who do not realize that they are full first-class citizen in France and they are willing to accept the dictate of the French government, which allows French government to continue to do these type of things, establishing organizations for Muslims. Why then the people who are second or the third or the fourth generation in France, they don't organize and say, hey, wait a minute, you have no right to do that?
Well, actually, Mr. Imam, two things to answer your question. The first one is that why is this still possible? The handpicked leaders of the Muslims that are chosen by the government, they get their legitimacy not from the grassroots. It doesn't come because they have been carried on the shoulders of the community and they can speak on their behalf. They have been handpicked by the government itself, even this time with this new forum on French Islam. And the government itself said it. We took note of what was happening in Muslim communities, and we handpicked the interesting leaders we want to be talking to. The same way they did in the colony. I mean, there is nothing new under the sun right now. So first, absolute no legitimacy for these leaders. The second thing, and I think, and I'm reaching the limits of my mandate as a human rights activist, is that it also has to do with the way religion is being taught in many Muslim communities, that people are told that they have to obey and never apply critical thinking, that they must follow their leaders from amongst them, even though those leaders were elected by no one, were chosen by either the government or chose themselves to be the local imam, the head of the local charity, etc. And in turn, there is an absolute lack of transparency in those organizations, and people rule or manage these organizations, these charities, and by extension, deal with the broader community the same way a dictator of the Muslim world would deal with his country. And that's why there is no capacity for Muslims to organize at the local level. Now, does that remove the responsibility of each citizen to stand up and say something and at least express disagreement? Absolutely not. When you see things going, off center for decades, when you grow up and you realize that by the time you become an adult, your rights have shrunk, that the people who speak on your behalf always have the same profile. They either barely speak French or are completely politically ignorant when it comes to dealing with the state and lack the courage to speak up to the government because they know their legitimacy is not a popular legitimacy. It is coming from the bureaucrats in the Ministry of Interior, for example. So that's why everyone has to answer, to ask him or herself, what is my responsibility in allowing this to happen, by either remaining silent, by funding organizations that do not answer back on their action, and of course, on top of it, how am I, by my sole presence in those meetings, giving legitimacy by my presence into these illegitimate meetings? So there is, I think it's really time to ponder and question. I wrote a piece for the British-based organization called the Islamic Human Rights Committee, and it was titled, or it is titled, France Understanding the Roots of the Anti-Separatism Law. And I come on all these, the functioning of the Muslim communities in France for the past decades, and how this in turn allows illegitimate leaders to rise and become prominent, and then have political power and the upper hand. And at the same time, it allows what Emmanuel Macron is doing, literally while shutting down Muslim organizations, setting up new ones to say, this is the brand of Islam we want, these are the leaders we want to support, and anything else is part of the so-called political Islam, radical Islam, and are to be either shut down or prosecuted.
So you mentioned the term of French Islam, that this forum which the government is trying to establish, or it has already established by handpicked people in the Muslim community, they want French Islam. So what is French Islam according to their perspective?
Again, we have teachings that go back to the colonies. They want a brand of Islam that strips Muslims of their political identity, their social identity. They are just believers. That's it. They pray, they fast. If they're rich enough, they go to Mecca, and that's it. They don't get involved in the local affairs of the broader community in the American sense of the word, the city hall council, dealing with the local government, dealing with the national government, expressing opposition, support, etc. They do not exist as citizens. They're only believers. And if I can make a provoking allegory on this situation, it's as if you put people in an internment camp, right? And they are to be happy, they're supposed to be happy as long as they pray on time, they fast, they eat, but in no way, shape, or form should they aspire to leave the internment camp, because that's the limits of their freedom. And that's exactly what the government wants. It doesn't want to see the rise of French Muslim citizens who are part of opposition to tyranny, opposition to corruption, who stand on their own as communities. The same way you see that happening with Catholics, Protestants, Jews, non-believers, etc. When they see something wrong, they are not prosecuted for doing so. They will call them, they oppose government policies. But if that happens from within the ranks of Muslims, it becomes a crime or a felony, and therefore that needs to stop. So this is the brand of Islam that Emmanuel Macron wants, in complete violation of course, the French Constitution, but also by going against human nature. We are political beings. We do politics from the moment we wake up until we go to sleep, by dealing with people at our workplace, with our friends, etc. We are constantly dealing with other people in terms of how can I exist in this world. But that for Muslim, according to Macron and his likes, and thanks to the blessings of these government-picked Muslim leaders, it is happening, and I hope French Muslims will one day say no.
I was sitting in a State Department at the United States, and one leader in high position commented, well, this thing has to do with elections. Once elections are over, this thing will calm down. Do you agree with that type of logic?
No, absolutely not. I mean, that's really not looking at the big picture. As we said in your introduction, and I thank you for it, when things start to escalate before an election, they never come down. And if you take a look at the past 20, 25 years, the situation of French Muslims, of course, gets worse after each election, but every single time we cross a new limit, and then it goes from bad to worse. So now they're even prohibit to combat so-called radicalization. They are banning Muslim girls from, taking part in sports competition, in soccer, in football, for example, despite the FIFA, the international body regulating football, saying these women are welcome to practice their sport. They want to fight radicalization by shutting down human rights organizations. So what people in the US have to realize is that there is a return to fascism happening right now in Europe. And I don't think Americans or people across the Atlantic realize how the failure of the European project, the European Union project, has stalled for the past 20 years, and that minorities are being used as scapegoats to justify all the failures of European Union and its member states, but also to use that as what I call Islamo-diversion. Anytime you have a problem dealing with the economics or unemployment or corruption, scandal, etc., create a Muslim problem and let it be the sole issue that the French people would deal with, to entertain the crowd and make them passionate about their identity. Muslims have not, slashed jobs by the millions. Muslims have not thrown Greece into debt. Muslims have not destroyed the environment or participate in the tax evasion schemes that cost us around 100 billion euros a year for French taxpayers. But Muslims, if you listen to the news and politicians, they are the only problem. No, the only problem is or are failed nation states and a failed transnational project called the European Union.
Tell us this, how Muslims in France are responding to this? Are there Muslims, organizations or individuals or intellectuals who have aligned with other French people to say publicly oppose this venture of another Muslim organization called Forum on Islam?
Well, there are, and thank God, frankly, there are many of them. There are some writing, making podcasts, organizing rallies, taking part in debates when they are allowed to by mainstream media. But the problem is the atomization of the left and the weak political situation of Muslims makes it that two weak entities cannot make a strong ally or a strong alliance. It is very difficult to achieve that goal. So what it means is that the left, gets beaten at each election. The left lost its battle for intellectual and cultural hegemony, and in return, Muslims have been non-existent politically forever, since the mid-1970s. But despite their struggles being carried from one generation to another, what needs to happen right now, Mr. Imam, is that people go from calling out injustice and constantly making statements to having political effectiveness. How can you go from taking note of what's happening to achieving political goals? Electoral victories could be one issue, but that's not enough. How can ideas can go from the fringe, of the mainstream into the center of the mainstream? How can people come forward and get a strong foothold in the mainstream media? So there is a lot to be accomplished, and unfortunately, people are acting alone, isolated, not really in a proper coordination, and this means that people from within the government, allied with the major economic interests, have a need to keep things as they are. Don't ask us about neoliberal policies. The richer will continue to get richer. The state will gain ever more powers, and as long as you are atomized, unfortunately, you will be the one paying for it.
Well, thank you so much, Yasser Louati, for your time. Yasser Louati is a human rights activist in Paris, France, joining us from there. Assalamu alaikum.